Yes, so let's continue. So in the second hour, what I thought I'm going to talk about is kind of analyzing very big scientific data. It follows to a large degree what I talked about in the first hour, in the sense that database management systems, data management, the methods we have are not entirely adequate for some of the jobs that we're seeing in scientific applications. And whilst the title here is fairly generic, what I'm going to talk about is the work that we've done in the connection with the Blue-Brain project initially, and now with the Blue-Brain. Let me start from a little bit more generic perspective. Because what is happening in recent years is a move towards data-driven scientific discovery, which means that no longer do we simply, study a phenomenon, come up with a theory, define an experiment, collect the data, or design an experiment, execute the experiment, collect the data, and then analyze it to support the initial hypothesis. What we do instead is we just scan the entire sky, knowing to some degree what we're looking for, but not having complete knowledge, not having a complete hypothesis, and then we analyze this data in detail to find the hypothesis as well as the support for it in the data. This has been happening in the observational sciences, but also in simulation sciences. No longer do we simply is simulation is a pen and paper exercise. What we do instead is we build a model, simulate it on a supercomputer, and then analyze the resultant data. What this has led to is tremendous amounts of data. I'm listing them here. It's a kind of a number dropping exercise. In the sense that the Large Hadron Collider experiment produces 12 petabytes of data per experiment. And when I say experiment, that's not just something you run every day, but this is a massive experiment. So 12, but still 12 petabytes is a massive amount of data. And that's all data that doesn't just have to be stored, that's data that has to be analyzed. And that is something that I think supercomputing people sometimes tend to forget a little bit, is that it's not just about storing data, it's also about processing and analyzing. And the Longitudinal Sky Survey, 4 petabytes of data is being produced per year. In the successor of this Longitudinal Sky Survey, the Large Synoptic Survey Telescope, I think it's 20 petabytes per night. That's a lot of data that needs to be reduced from the get-go, otherwise we can't analyze it. And finally, the Human Brain Project, which is probably citing Davis number that we at some point calculated, which is per simulation second, we're producing 100 gigabytes of data. That's not necessarily data that is all of it's going to be stored, that's as much data as is being produced. And scientists are to some degree overwhelmed with this massive amount of data, simply because analysis of it is challenging. And the problem is, it's not just that this data is big today, it's also growing rapidly. There's several underlying trends, but in all kinds of disciplines, data is growing massively. What I'm plotting here is on the x-axis number of years, right, the years, and on the y-axis the cumulative size of data sets, as reported in several studies. And what we're seeing is that in astronomy, I think yes, astronomy data is growing rapidly over the years. The same is happening in physics, almost exponential. In simulation sciences, it's also growing very fast, as well as in gene sequencing. There's several underlying trends here. One is, for example, that for astronomy, for physics, and for gene sequencing, or particularly for astronomy and physics, the reason is that the instruments are becoming much more precise, meaning you can record more data per experiment. Right? So the data is more stable. In gene sequencing, it's to some degree the same effect. The precision is getting higher, but also there, the important trend is that the hardware is getting massively cheaper. So you can sequence now a lot of genetic information in almost no time at all, also making data rapidly. And in the simulation sciences, it's mostly that hardware is getting faster. It's kind of a form of precision, if you will, and that the deployments are getting bigger, and so more data is being produced there. So the scientific data is growing exponentially. Now I want to go particularly to talk about the simulation sciences, where the growth of the data is a multi-dimensional problem, basically three dimensions. One is coverage, duration, and then finally resolution. And it's growing along all these dimensions. Right? Coverage means that the size of the models are growing by orders of magnitude. For example, in the Blue-Brain project, when we started collaborating with the guys at the Blue-Brain project, I think we started with a model of 1,600 neurons, 1,692 to be precise. And now we're looking at models in the order of 100,000 neurons and millions of neurons. Right? So the coverage, the size of the models is growing. At the same time, the resolution is growing. Initially, what we used is very, very coarse grain representation of neurons. We've dealt with mostly in the Blue-Brain project in the phase of the model building, where we actually have a spatial model of the neurons. And initially, these were represented, each neuron was represented spatially with several thousand cylinders, three-dimensional cylinders, right? And what we now move to today, in parts, not entirely, we're looking at mesh representations which have many, many more data points, right? There's going to be thousands, tens of thousands of triangles, so that means that also makes the model bigger, right? Or in size, at least in this size, and we still. So the level of detail is also increasing, and then finally we increase the duration, simulation duration, and that means that also the amount of data being generated grows. And these three dimensions are not independent as such, they're multiplicative. We are moving on each of these dimensions through two more coverage, two longer duration, two high resolution. That really means that the data is growing rapidly. So in the Blue-Brain project, and I'm going to use Blue-Brain and Human Brain interchangeably here because I'm really confused about where one starts. But in the Blue-Brain project, we have a very, very simplistic workflow that I'm using. Is you have the observational data, literature, lab data, neuroscience data. That goes into the phase of spatial modeling. The spatial model is then being simulated, and now comes the post-simulation data. And what's important here is that when I say simulation or just the model of it, this is not necessarily a neural network as such. What the Blue-Brain project, the way the models are built, is really the spatial representation of the neurons. We put several thousand of these neurons together, calculate where the synapses are, and then use this model to simulate. So it may not entirely correspond, then when I say simulating, it's my mind may not entirely correspond to your understanding of simulation. But the way it's done in Blue-Brain project really banks a lot on spatial data, and so what we need is exploration, static 3D exploration, where you want to retrieve part of the model, check certain properties of it, interactive 3D exploration to visualize parts of the model, and spatial analysis to, in this case of the Blue-Brain project, just means to find out exactly where the synapses need to be placed in the model. That's typically where, by and large, where two neurons intersect with each other. It has been determined relatively early on to be a very accurate biorealistic representation of the basic synapses. Yes?
Just how exactly is the spatial data stored? Is it stored with reference to a fixed grid point, or is it more of a vector continuous data? Because that truly determines how this analysis is done on that person.
So basically, I'm not sure. Let me check. I'm going to get to that on the next slide if that's okay with you, Jim. One of the next slides. So these are the operations we need, and then for the simulation we also need dynamic 3D exploration. So what we ultimately need to support the data management in this spatial modeling and simulation is scalable spatial access methods. And that's what I have been working with the neuroscientists in the Blue-Brain project along with PhD students in the last couple of years. And what I'd like to do today is basically give you an overview of what we've done. I'm going to focus, for reasons of time, I'm just going to focus on 3 of these aspects, what we've done for them: static 3D exploration, interactive 3D exploration, and dynamic 3-dimensional exploration. So, the static 3-dimensional exploration. This is really about building the model of a small part of the brain. What goes in is single neuron 3-dimensional models. And this is a spatial representation with thousands of cylinders like I mentioned. That's basically, I think that could answer your question in the sense that we just have, 3-dimensional cylinders in space. So it's kind of a vector-based representation. We put them together, we basically define the recipe according to the brain region you want to simulate, the model you want to build. We say I have different layers, different composition, different types of neurons in each of these layers. You put that together, and you arrive or you get a tissue model of a small part of the brain. What is then really crucial is to execute 3D spatial range quiz. You want to know exactly what is in the circle part of this model you've built. Because you want to verify that this is biorealistic. So you want to know, do I have enough on this layer? Do I have enough of these type of neurons? Is the density of the model good enough? Is this biorealistic? Yes?
A question, how good can you know, I interpret this way, actually look at the brain and you build the 3-dimensional model, a part of it that you see.
Yeah.
How good is the resolution? Can you actually see the individual neurons, or is it like a lot of approximations that you think, yeah, it seems to be like this, so I'm going to extend my model a little bit?
That's an interesting question. It's very precise.
Yeah.
So it's not an approximation, but I couldn't, it's used, I'm not entirely sure what technology, it's light field spectroscopy is used for it. For what I know, it's a very labor-intensive process. I'm not sure where, obviously it's not an exact representation of the so there must be some approximation or some loss of precision somewhere, but it's a very accurate representation.
Oh, single neurons and synapses.
Exactly. Well, that's an interesting question because, basically, the Lunar project, from what I understand, from what I've talked to the people actually doing this, they take these models, they make the models themselves, and they use basically get one neuron model out of a rat. So it's, and you lose all information. So when you build a model, then in SQL, you have neurons from different rats, essentially, from different rats' brains. So you lose all this information about where the synapses are, right? But you have different types of neurons, and then no, I'm not going to talk about that. But really the way to then infer where the synapses are placed is to do what we call spatial joining, is to see where exactly the cylinders or the representation of different neurons intersect with each other, and that's where synapses are placed.
And this is, you see this in the experimental data?
Sorry?
Where they intersect, you see, look at the experimental data and you see where they intersect.
Yes, exactly, yes. Well, we basically, what we're given is, they use light field spectroscopy or something for this. They get these models out in 3D representation, they give us the recipe, we put together the model and then we see where it is. Okay, so what you need to do here is really execute loads and loads of these spatial range queries, thousands of them, in order to verify that what you're about to simulate is really biorealistic. And so what you need is an efficient spatial index. Now, spatial indexes are not something that are fundamentally new. However, they are a bit of an odd construct. If you remember from the last hour, I've been talking about B-tree indexes. B-tree indexes are for one-dimensional data. It's very easy. You have a complete, total over all the objects, right? Because that's great to store on lists, for example, because you can then just store the data in total on this. This is also one-dimensional, to a large degree one-dimensional technology, and so that becomes really easy. Once you go to three-dimensional data, or just two-dimensional data, you don't have any total over anymore. So you can store one data item next, that is, you can store two spatial elements next together in space next to each other on this. It was really challenging to do this. And so to approximate or to solve that problem, what people have been doing is developed what is called an R tree. It's basically a three-dimensional extension of B tree. And the way it works is, this has been proposed, I think, in the 80s. The way it works is if you have a number of spatial objects, you wrap each one of them in a bounding box, which approximates the object. And you do this recursively. So you first wrap every object in a bounding box, then each of these bounding boxes into another bounding box, and build a hierarchy of these bounding boxes until you wrap everything into one tree, into one node, right? The entire spatial data set. And what you can then do is, if you have a range query, right, it works the same as a B tree. You check with what it intersects, and then you follow it down to the objects, to retrieve the objects which are in particular in an exact range. Now that's very similar to B tree, but the issue is that we have here overlap. That means these boxes here, because there is no total order of the objects, we have overlap here. So if we for example, if we follow, basically everywhere where the boxes of the same color overlap, and if we want to have one executed query that touches this part here, what we need to do is we need to follow down two paths in the tree, because we don't know where the result will actually be, or both that might contribute to the result. So we need to execute this over several subtrees query until we arrive at the final result. And it's not just going to be, like I'm showing here, two paths that need to be followed in the tree. It's going to be hundreds and thousands of paths in the tree that need to be followed. And that really has an impact on the performance of the query execution. So this structural overlap really degrades the performance of the query execution. Yes?
Why do we need the overlap?
Sorry?
Why do we need the overlap?
There is no way in which you can arrange the objects so that you're not going to have any overlap.
If you have smaller squares?
Yes.
Or I mean, couldn't you make a grid or something?
A grid, yes, you could make a grid. So in general, there are two, when it comes to spatial indexing, there are two types of indexes. One are grid-based, and one are what is called space-oriented, and the other type is data-oriented. This is a data-oriented approach, and it basically, the advantage of data-oriented indexes is that you can easily use them on objects with volume. In the grid-based case, right, we have a grid, and you have an object, we have several objects, you map it on the grid. What if an object intersects with several grid cells, right? You need to replicate it, basically.
So here you actually have one object per cell.
At most, yeah.
Yeah,
exactly.
okay.
So you don't need to replicate the objects, making it a bit more efficient. But it's a trade-off, right? If you, for example, if you're really, I mean, you're absolutely right. If you have problem data, use the grid index. Right? It's much more efficient. But if you have objects with extent, the data-oriented index is more. So the overlap degrades the performance, and we have measured this, right? We just looked at the scalability of different variants of this R tree, and we measured the time it takes for executing 500 queries, depending on the data, what we call the data set density, or the size of the data set. And what should happen, all of them grow, and what should happen though is that it should stay flat. It should stay. I mean, it's an index. It should just be the lookup should have to go down the tree once. So it's the height of the tree, is your cost, then retrieve the data, right? So the trend should really be exactly flat. So the state of the art doesn't scale very well with density, right, or with the data set size. An index always tries to decouple execution time from data set size, but clearly that isn't the case here. Now what we have done is we have designed a new index which we call flat, and the key idea is that we're going to use two phases, each of which is independent of overlap. Really the problem of overlap that makes the state of the art degrade. The way it works is we have, as I said, two phases. We execute a query by first finding any one object within the range query, right? any one object, doesn't matter, and then we find, we do the crawling phase, we traverse the neighborhood, and we find all other elements within this range. Right? So what we do is we use the connectivity to overlap. And I'm just claiming here that obviously this is independent of overlap, independent of density, but I will show how this works. So what it does need is we identified any random object, we just chose this one here. What we then need to do is find all other objects. And this is fairly easy if you have a data set where all objects are connected with each other. Right? You could say, for example, you could say we're connected from one cylinder to the next. But there are also cylinders which are not connected. And so what we need to enable this crawling phase is reachability. We need some means to go from one cylinder to the next. Right? This is quite difficult, or can become quite difficult problem to solve if we have random or arbitrary objects. They're not going to have any connectivity. We just have a couple of boxes here. If you have a convex data set geometry, if this is your query, right, there's not going to be any path between this part and this part here. So if we choose a random object here, we're not going to be able to go over here. Unless we go outside the query region, which in itself can become a problem. We don't really have a proper slot criteria to do so. So what we need is some means of reachability. And this is a problem that can be solved easily in some data sets, like earthquake simulation, where the complete mesh there, you always have reachability, right? But for our setup, this is not the case, and not every data set satisfies this requirement. So what we do is when we build the index, we add this sort of reachability information. So during the index building phase, we partition the entire data. We group spatially closed elements into bunches of elements and bunches of cylinders, and then we connect neighboring partitions. Like so. It's very straightforward. And what we make sure is an optimization for this index to run on this. What we do is we make sure that each of these blocks basically fit exactly on this page to make it more efficient, so that when we retrieve it from this, we know we make the best of this plan. So we have this connectivity and we enable through it recursive crawling. Now I still owe you to tell you why this actually is independent of overlap and independent of density. The way it works now, the way the whole algorithm executes is we first use the seeding phase to find a start element, right? And what we actually do, and this might sound a bit counterintuitive, what we do is we use an arbitrary to find a start element. And you might try to ask, well, does this scale with density? I just make the point. It took some time to make the point, and then arbitraries don't scale well. And now I'm telling you that we're going to use an arbitrary for this. The difference that we're making is that when we execute a range query, and we have to find all elements inside one query, that's a costly operation. But if we say we just need one arbitrary element within the range query, that's not an expensive operation. Because we just need to follow down the tree just one path, right? We don't care which element it is, it just needs to be inside the range. And that's an operation that really is just in the order of the height of the tree. That's a fairly cheap operation. So the seeding operation is fast, basically depends on the number of these pages read depends more or less on the height of the tree, and that is independent of data density. So with that, we have a random element, and the seeding phase avoids overlap in the other tree. So we're still, for the seeding phase, we're pretty efficient. And then in the crawling phase, what we do is we use the neighbor links that we introduced in the additional data structure to crawl from one seed partition to the rest. So we can then just recursively find with all the links between these partitions, we find all the elements within the range query. And also this is a efficient operation that only depends on the primarily depends on the result set size. So we have two phases, one which depends on the height of the artery, of the seed artery, which is independent of density. We have a second phase which primarily depends on the result set size. And when it comes to result set size, there's not much we can do about it. I mean, at the end of the day, the query wants to retrieve the result, so we have to retrieve it. There's not much we can say there. So, just to compare this to the other approaches that I've shown before, I'm showing here the same experiment as we did before, the motivation experiment. We measure time on the y-axis to execute 500 random queries, range queries, and we increase the data set size, the data set density on the x-axis. And of course, the other R3 variants that have been developed over the years, still the performance is obviously the same as in the previous graph, but for our approach of flat, it indeed stays pretty much flat. The execution time stays flat. We are at 7.8 for this experiment here, 7.8 times faster than the fastest R3 variant. What's more important though is that index manages to decouple the execution time from density and from the data set size. Right? We basically stay as flat as is possible. There is a slight increase. If you look at the line here, is a slight increase, and that's mostly because of the result set size becoming bigger. The more dense the data set gets, if we keep the query size the same, which is what we do, you'll have more results to retrieve, and that makes it, in that sense, a bit slower. We did, I'm about to say we did another experiment, but we didn't do another experiment. What we did is we just plotted in a different way. Yes, with the same x-axis, data set density increasing, but here what we measure is the time per result object. So this should account for the fact that the bigger we go, the bigger the data set becomes, the more result elements we have to retrieve. And so we measure time per result object. For the RG variance, this keeps on increasing because the overlap is hitting or is degrading performance, but for flat, it actually decreases, which is really what we want to achieve in this for this type of index. And what is happening more precisely is that we start out relatively high because we have this fixed cost of the seeding phase, right? But the more result elements we have, and we'll have more result elements, the bigger the data set becomes, the better we can trade this off, the better we can amortize this initial cost of the result elements. Yes, actually that's what I wanted to say there. Seeding cost can be amortized with increased result cardinality. So flat really scales with density, and that's what we kind of want to accomplish. And what we've done with this algorithm is we have integrated it into the model building process in the Blueprint project, in the sense that once now, if you build a model and you do the Blueprint project, you define a recipe, you have these type of neurons at this level, at this layer, and then it's going to be generated on the blue gene, and the index is built along with it, so that when they want to verify biologic accuracy, they can easily do so with the help of flat. Okay, so that was the first part about spatial modeling. Now I have to talk about interactive 3D exploration. It's kind of similar to executing one spatial range query, but what the researchers now want to do is actually to execute a sequence of these range queries. So not longer just one, but a sequence there. And it's not that these sequences are completely random, the location of the queries are random, they actually follow some structure through the neural network, right? And this is not just true for neurons or for neural networks, this is also true for other types of data set. We've also seen this when working with other researchers. For an arterial tree of the heart, or a bronchial tree of the lung, you also have the same patterns. You have a certain structure you want to follow, and you execute spatial range queries along the way. So this guided analysis is ubiquitous in scientific applications, really executing one query at a time, one meeting after another. And the problem is, it's an interactive process. You execute one query, you look at the result, you do some analysis, you do some computation, and then you look at the result of the computation, and then you decide where to go next. There is some sort of structure, you have some kind of path that you can follow, but you don't know a priori exactly where the path is going to be. Now, it is fairly straightforward to accelerate this, right, by prefetching. So what you can do is you execute the first query, you access the disk, you just stick the result part, you process the result, then you execute the second query, and then you access process the results, look at them, and then you go to the third query, and so on. In between, when the disk is idle, when we process the results from the first query or any of the queries, we actually have a really good prefetching opportunity. The disk is always going to be a slow part in the setup, so when it's idle, we want to make good use of it and know that we already read in data from the disk into main memory. Right? And so what we can then do is we can prefetch, so we execute the first query. Once we execute, or once we see already part of the result, we predict where the next queries might be. Right? Then we process the results from the first query. These results are going to be processed here, and we prefetch data based on this prediction that we did in the CPU. Right? So that's how we can accelerate this, and then ideally, the second query, retrieving query results from this is going to be much shorter because we already have retrieved part of the result. Ideally, hopefully, we already have some results. And then we can shorten down the time to retrieve the query results. We still have to do the processing in the memory or in on the CPU, and then we're going to prefetch data and so on. So this should accelerate query execution quite a bit. So the predictive prefetching can hide the data retrieve cost, but the difficulty is how are we going to know where to prefetch, right? That's the big question. And there's been some work on this before. Predictive prefetching has been done before. We're not the first one to look into this issue. But most of the previous approaches depend on very simplistic idea, which is you extrapolate past query locations. Now, we tested this for three approaches from literature, and what we saw is that the volume of the query really defines how well they work. The volume of the query really defines how well they work. So in this preliminary experiment we did, we measured the caching rate, which says how much data did we prefetch correctly, can we reuse for the next query. So that's what we measured on the y-axis, and the x-axis we have queries of different size for left, increasing from left to right. And it kind of shows very well that the bigger we go with the query, the worse the prediction becomes. The query, the caching rate drops massively, goes down, well, it starts at 45%, which is amazing to begin with, but it goes down to about 10% or less for the best approach. Why is this? What could be the problem? Well, it's quite simple actually. If we have very small volume queries, extrapolating the next query location based on the previous query locations is fairly easy to do, right? You're going to be quite accurate. But if you have a large volume query, you just take into account, into consideration, the position of the prefetch. It's very, very hard to do so correctly because inside the queries, the path might twist and bend in a completely unpredictable way. And so, based on this position here, these two positions, who predicted the next location would be here. But the path inside, the guiding path inside the query, really just take any particular different route. So, existing work works very well with small queries, but not at all with big queries. big queries just only take into account the position of the past queries is not going to give enough information pretty accurately. Yes?
Yes, can you not just use smaller queries? Like how you organize your data if you want to use one of these techniques?
That's you could. It really depends on your use case and your application. For example, I think for visualization, you need bigger queries. You could fundamentally maybe find another way of doing it. Just as you said, you could use small queries to begin with and then expand them. That could be an approach. Yeah. Yes.
Is it possible that you could start parallelizing this in the sense of the impression you get is that when you're reading out one, you're only going to try and get your next predicted place.
Yes.
And as you're saying, it might be that you diverge off by a little amount by the direction, but you hypothesize it's still in the local area. So if you were to search out by, say, north, south, east, and west, there would be 4 chances instead of 1, which means maybe you should be able to carry on and get a better hit rate just by doing parallelization.
Absolutely. I mean, this could be done very well. It's really something you have to bet on several different locations, right? You're not just going to bet on one and hope for the best. So yes, you could parallelize it. At the same time, the issue might become that you're parallelizing access to disk, right? You do this in parallel, which leads typically to a lot of random seeks, which makes the process slow. But if you could replicate the whole data source and then parallelize it, that would be. Yeah.
And it also depends on how long it actually takes to do the processing. Because what if on the slide beforehand you had that the amount of time to fetch was pretty much the same size as the processing. But if the processing takes 5 times as long as the fetch does because you're doing a lot of processing, you could do that even in sequence and hopefully get around it.
Absolutely, yeah. No, that's absolutely right. We did parallelization, we didn't look into in this iteration of the work. So what we developed based on these shortcomings of the related work is what we call Scout, which is content-aware prefetching. It's very simple, in essence. What you want to do is you want to inspect the query results. You want to identify what are the possible paths, and based on that, you want to predict next query using the guiding path. The difficulty, however, is that this is a very small example of a query, result of a query with all the possible paths in there, with all the neuron structures in there, and it might be the user might be following any one of these paths. So the challenge is to identify which one it is exactly. So we need to identify the guiding path. Now, how do we define the path? We have essentially, the query results are the cylinders that we've seen before. Cylinders from the 3 to 3-dimensional representations of the neurons, and we need to connect them to find this type of graph structure. So we need a graph framework that essentially gives us the exact graphs that represent the structure. And the problem is, fundamentally, that if you want to have an exact result, we need to go to each of these cylinders, compare it with each other cylinder to find out which ones technically connect. There's a certain margin of error there. But still, we could do this, but it's an iterative process which takes too much time. What we've decided to do is we use a grid hash where we basically take a uniform grid, map all the cylinders on the end of the cylinders on it, and then connect them up as an approximation. This is not an exact result, but it serves very well as an approximation, and then gives us this graph structure. What's also nice about this is that it's independent from the data representation, whether we're looking at neurons represented by cylinders, whether we're looking at meshes representing one of the lung, of the heart, or anything like that. We map it on a grid and we get a data independent of graph structure independent of the data representation. Now, that just gives us the graph structure. We still need to identify exactly what is the path user is following so that we can prefetch accurately. That's challenging, right? I showed you this picture with tons of different structures, tons of different paths the user might be following. What we need to find out is exactly which path is it that we need to narrow down the number of possibilities quite rapidly. Luckily, we can do so by using iterative candidate pruning. What I mean by that is that the guiding path, the path the user is following, is going through all the queries. So it's going to do through the first query, and if these are all possible paths here, right, it's going, the one path the user is following is going through the first query. So then we know these are all, this is the candidate sets, this is maybe 6 paths that we still need to follow, right? But then we know the path that he's following must go through this first query, through the second query as well, through the third query and through the fourth query and so on. And with each consecutive query, we can further narrow down the number of possible paths that he's most likely to follow. So we can narrow down the candidate set, and in reality, it actually turns out that we can identify the guiding path reliable after 5-6 queries, which is very good. And based on that, we can predict a new query and retrieve the data. And it's obviously true that the longer the sequence, the better prediction. The longer the sequence, the better we can narrow down the candidate set. Yes?
Just one question, would it be smarter, actually, instead of having to predict this, to just let the user of the database supply the valid paths? So instead of, I mean, he should know he's following some structure, could just tell the
Not necessarily, right? I mean, you know, one of these structures might bifurcate, right? In which case, I mean, which path is the user going to follow, right? I mean, absolutely, you're absolutely right. If this information is available, let's use it, let's make it easy, right? Let's make our lives easy. It turns out, though, that it's in many cases it is not known, and it's particularly not known if there are bifurcations, which one of this is. If it's known, you know, this is fairly simple. Because then you just retrieve all the data and compute to yourself. Right? Whereas here it's really an interactive process. You retrieve the data, compute something on it, let the user decide where to go next. Okay, so now I already said it before. We could just execute one query that gives the location. What is probably smarter is to actually, this is a bit, the slide is a bit suboptimal, but I'll just move it forward and make it a bit more sense. So what we actually do is we try to prefetch in different regions to make sure that we don't just bet on one region and are completely wrong. So what we do is we start, depending on how much time we have to load the data, we check the exit point, and then we execute queries of increasing size at the exit point and we prefetch like this until we run out of time, until the user has decided where to go next, at which point we try to use as much data, prefetch data as possible for the next query, and then retrieve the rest. Okay? Now, to the results. What we measure primarily here for the results is the prediction accuracy. So we use, here again, like in the previous example, we use 100,000 neurons, which was by and large the biggest model the Blue Brain project was using for quite a while, with 450 million 3D cylinders amounting to 27 gigabytes on disk. And we have measured this for 2 different sequences, one with a relatively big query volume of 80K and one with a small 20K micron, cube micron. The sequence length is in both cases 32. We define the caching rate as the amount of data retrieved from cache over the total amount of data retrieved. And we compare basically the known approaches, and as you can see, particularly for big queries, we do Scalability is doing very well. We get roughly 70% accuracy over the others by just using previous prepositions to extrapolate the position. They only get up to 20%. And for the smaller queries, Scalability is doing a bit better with 90%. What is interesting here is that the other approaches are doing substantially better. They basically almost double their precision, and that's really because of the issue with small queries where it's much likely to be correct with the naive approaches. Okay, so we get roughly between 72 and 91% prediction accuracy, and that means, I mean, prediction accuracy is one thing, but for us that basically means we can, whereas prediction with best EWMA, best related approach, that leads to speed of executing the whole query sequence in a factor of 2, we get a speed of a factor of 14.7x out of it. Okay, so yeah, let me just. So okay, yeah. So basically, Scout essentially shows that when we go, instead of just using this very, very limited information of query position, when we actually look at the query content, we get a lot of much higher cache hit rate and much better speed up overall. Okay, with that, and keeping in mind the time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to move on to the last part, which is the one about the dynamic 3D exploration. This is a bit of a different thing, in the sense that it's not necessarily relates to spatial modeling, not to building the model, but much rather to simulate. And when I say simulate here is, I mean, the Blue-Brain project has had two different ways of building the circuit. So it has had one particular way of building the circuit, which is to, as I said, take several thousand neurons, put them together, and then check where they intersect, and that's where you place the synapses. That leaves a lot of empty space in the model, right? Because you just take two neurons, you put them together, well, they're going to touch top line, but the other space is completely empty, which is not a model either. So what they have been doing is they started to mold these models together. I mean, there's several different approaches that we're trying to follow. Is basically take these static models, 3D representation, and you kind of mold them together in order to reduce the empty space between neurons. Right? And for that, you simulate the molding process based on one of these input models. And what you need to do once you simulate it is you need to monitor these models, how they're being molded as the simulation runs. So what you end up with from a data management perspective is you need to be able to execute range queries on a fast-changing mesh model in main memory. And it's really just a collection of polyhedra that they're dealing with. So polyhedra basically just a couple of 3D vertices that are connected together, and you connect several of those together and you get a volumetric mesh model, and these then mold together. And these meshes enable high precision 3D models. Now, with respect to what they need to do is to monitor this simulation of these mesh models, and what is happening here is that we have, in a simulation time step, we have a massive amount of updates, and when we have in the monitoring phase, so this really goes by, we simulate a part, we monitor a part, we monitor a bit, we simulate more, we monitor, and so on. So it's always a change between simulating and monitoring. And the simulation that has a hundred updates, and in the monitoring has we have a few queries to monitor the progress. Right? And this always changes, as I said, for simulation time set, monitoring time set, and then simulation time set again. The problem here is how can we efficiently execute these range queries? Because there's indexes, typically the one that I showed in the first part, B trees and R trees, and all kinds of indexes, they kind of are built once, but used many times to amortize the cost of building them. But here you have so many updates, it becomes really challenging. And it's not the only challenge, right? We have other challenges. We have the mesh detail challenge, We've already seen this in the Blu-ray project, but the meshes become ever more detailed, as much detail as is possible, right? They add polyhedra, more polyhedra, to make it much more fine-grained, and that makes it much harder for any data management solution, because the data set grows quite a bit. Then, as I said before, it's very dynamic. There are so many updates, and the updates every vertex, in virtually every vertex, in the data set is going to change the position at every time step. Right? So building an index is not going to be feasible. And what we need is a solution that scales, and that will scale for the future. Now, the state of the art, this is not necessarily a new data management problem, right? State of the art, we have moving object indexes. Indexes, that these are indexes that basically have been developed to support moving objects like cars and so on, right? So, and what you do typically is, instead of indexing the object, you basically make the object, we assume the object is going to have a constant trajectory in a particular direction, a constant speed, and then you make the box a little bit bigger, and so in the next time step, the car might have moved in the box, but the query is not entirely wrong, but at the same time it's not very efficient. Right? But what these moving object indexes assume, and that's quite crucial, is that you know something about the movement of the objects. You know, constant trajectory, constant speed, and so on. But that's something that we cannot assume. We have the mesh movement, which is inherently unpredictable. Then, on the other hand, we of course have the traditional static spatial indexes, like the R-tree, LER-tree, Q-tree, and other indexes. But the question here really is it worth building an index when you know in the next time you're not going to be able to use it at all, because it's been completely out of date. Updating indexes is also challenging. You can typically update an index, but you know, if every object has changed, you have to update every object, and it's typically cheaper to just build a new index. And what's actually quite interesting is that the linear scan, just scanning over the entire data set, is becoming a really interesting or efficient approach, because you have absolutely no support structure. You don't need any support structure. You don't need any data structure that you need to maintain between simulation steps. You just scan over the entire data set. But the problem here is, for these approaches, is they don't scale very well, particularly if you go from coarse-grained to more fine-grained meshes. So neither of these existing approaches, scales very well with the size or the detail of the data sets. Now, to illustrate the problem, you can sort of see how we work. We basically try to find the problem with the state of the art. We run some motivation experiment. So these are all, what we do here is we use a small data set with 33 gigabyte with 1.32 billion tetrahedral meshes, and we simulate it, or we run one of these simulations on it, and we check how existing approaches work on it. And as you can see, the existing approaches, particularly being OCTOPUS, LER, and Q-tree, on the right-hand side, are very, very small, very, very slow compared to the linear scan, which is really don't use any index at all. And what's interesting is that most of the time of these approaches is actually spent on maintenance. So OCTOPUS is spending almost 100% on maintenance, whereas the other spend between 70% and 80%. So clearly, there's something wrong with the state of the art. Right? Something is not efficient. The problem is quite simple, really. There's not enough queries are being executed in the monitoring phase to set off the cost that we need to invest in indexing and updating the indexes. There's just too much change in too few queries. And as a result, the linear scan outperforms all the index approaches. Now, our approach, our question is, can we do better? And I'm thinking you're guessing we probably can. So, what can we do? So we have basically the index approach, which reduces the search space. You don't have to scan the entire data. And we have the linear scan, which has the benefit of not requiring any maintenance. So can we use this? Can we in some way combine this? And yes, we can. What we have done is we've developed OCTOPUS, which uses the mesh connectivity to retrieve the query results. So it's kind of simple, but similar to what we've done with flat, in the sense that we try to find an element that is close to our query result, and then instead of using the connectivity that we use in flat, what we do is we use the vertices, the edges in the mesh to retrieve the remaining result. So we use the mesh connectivity for the query execution. So in essence, if you have in the time step 1, you want to execute a range query like so. We find one random element here, right, and we then use the edges to retrieve the remaining result. We can do this any time step at all. It's very easy and very efficient. You just need to find efficient way to find a random element. And this is Oblivious, updated Oblivious query execution, right? We don't mind the updates. At every time step, we only need to find a good starting point. But one big question is, what about non-convex meshes, which are essentially meshes with a hole, right? Here, it's a similar problem that we see in flat. If we have a query like so, if we find a random element here, there's not going to be any connection within the query range query to retrieve the entire result. There is always the basic idea to go outside the range query, reach and follow other paths, but it's really difficult to do so efficiently, and there's absolutely no guarantee to get the result, because ultimately you may have two completely separate elements or also separate meshes, and then you're not going to get from one to the other. So what we've done to address this issue is we said, let's just use the surface. The surface is it's very easy to find the surface, very easy to compute the surface, and we can basically then say we're going to take our random start elements from the surface, because we know every element will in some way or another connect to the surface. Every vertex in the result. And what we do is basically we do a surface scan, we scan the whole surface and find all starting elements in the range query on the surface, and then we search the remainder of the query. And that guarantees that we retrieve the complete result. Even if this were two different meshes or several different meshes, as long as we know the surface, we're gonna be able to compute the full entire result. And what's important though is we need to keep track of the surface, right? We need to know what elements are on the surface. And what's good about this is, if you have deformation of the mesh, which is what's happening in the simulation and in the Blueberry project, you have deformation of the mesh, the surface is going to stay the same. This is only becoming an issue once you rip up the surface, you rip up the meshes, then you have new surface elements, or if you glue them together, you lose surface elements, which is not too bad, but still needs to be accounted for. Then you need to update the surface elements. But if that doesn't happen, if you just have deformation, there's nothing you need to do about it. So this will scale with massive updates. Now, one interesting point I find really nice about this approach is that increasing mesh detail. OCTOPUS only depends on the surface mesh. We only depends on the surface mesh. We only need to keep track of the surface of the mesh, right? And as we grow more, as the details of the mesh grow, the vertices inside the mesh will grow cubical, which is a three-dimensional mesh. But the surface will only grow quadratic, which is bad enough, but at least it's not cubical. And so our approach depends will grow quadratically, whereas a linear scan will grow cubically with an increasing level of detail. So the surface grows slower than the volume, and we can easily or efficiently exploit that. So with that, this approach scales very well with the mesh resolution. Yeah. Okay. And if we look at the measurements here, we measure on the y-axis the total query execution time. Again, with the other, compared to the other approaches, we have two benchmarks, and yes, it's very obvious we do substantially better. Not just compared to the indexing approach, which is probably a bit of an unfair comparison, but also with the linear scan, who is supposed to do much better. We actually get an index in 7.3x acceleration compared to the linear scan. And what's also important is the scalability. We also tested that. We measured on the y-axis the total query execution time and increased the mesh detail on the x-axis. And compared to the linear scan, as well as I said before, right, the linear scan will suffer from the detail in a kind of cubic or will grow cubically, where OCTOPUS will only grow quadratically. And so we actually get, despite OCTOPUS getting slower with an increasing number of mesh momentum, and that's to be expected, we comparatively to the linear scan, we still get faster, or we have a higher speed up compared to the linear scan. And if you look at the breakdown of the operations, we have two different parts of the algorithm. One is surface scan, finding all the elements on the surface that are within the query range, and the second part, which is the graph traversal, that's finding all the result elements. We see that the graph traversal actually goes much faster than the surface scan. And the graph traversal will grow faster because the result is getting bigger. And so this is to be expected. So initially, 64% of the execution time are surface scan, and for the highest level of detail that we looked into, it's 41%. So essentially, it scales with mesh detail. Now, just an overview of what we've done. This is a bit broken, but anyway. So we have developed several algorithms. I've just talked about three here. Two for spatial analysis, which is Touch and Gypsy. Touch is basically, and also Gypsy is both algorithms to do spatial analysis to find out virtual places synapses. Flattened scout I've shown, this is used for model validation and workflow right now. And in the simulation we have OCTOPUS and triple join. And just recently we worked on studying to some degree the post-simulation data, and that's what we've developed Rubik for. Now, the algorithms we don't have had a substantial impact on the human brain project. When we started, really this number of 1,692 neurons is burned into my brain because that was the first circuit, the first model we've used, and it was really, really small. But since then, we've been able to grow the model massively. We went from 1,692 neurons to now 1 million reasons and 10 million, which is a theoretical maximum given the simulation infrastructure we have today. So it has, the work that we've done has had a tremendous or considerable impact on the Blue-Brain project, but there are still, I think, data management challenges remaining. I pointed to some of them in the previous presentation. Right? We have data privacy and utilization issues. That's particularly when it comes to when we go to the human brain, to medical informatics. Sub-project that deals with patient records. There we have an issue, right? Scalable query of petascale data is still a bit of an issue, particularly when it comes to spatial algorithms. There's simply not a lot of work done on growing to massive amounts of data. Cloud analytics, although we have Spark, I believe we're going to have to do a bit more there. And we also need something for the quick and efficient access to raw data. I said at some point, one big challenge of scientific data really is that it's so much, the particularly in the simulation sciences, there's so much data, it costs an enormous amount of time to index it, and if you're not sure how much you're going to query on it, is it really worth the trouble to index it? And that's where maybe some new ideas are coming into play, like access to raw data, where you basically don't index it, you don't ingest it in a database, it costs so much time, but you access the data with particular set of tools, and you do some sort of, you basically change the layout of your data on the go, and so that your queries are going to be substantially faster in the future. Or what you can also do is your data processing. You have some storage which has some additional compute that you can use to do some kind of indexing, aggregation of data, or identifying interesting data. Other areas where I think still work is needed is distributed workflow execution. Then provenance and reproducibility is a big issue. Everybody in the human brain project, well, not everybody, but a lot of people are talking about it. But this kind of the understanding is a bit limited in the sense that provenance or data lineage is kind of understood as this magic sauce that everybody needs and wants, but it's not entirely sure how it's going to be used. But it's definitely something really important in the sense that you know, now in the Blueprint projects has been discussed for a while, just shed all the results. Just do away with all the results. We don't need the results to store all of them, they're just too big. We're not going to analyze them anyway, most likely we'll analyze them anyway, but just re-execute the simulation. But that opens so many issues, like you need to use the same versions of the code. It's going to be, there's a certain randomness in the simulation to begin with. Results are never going to be the same. So what you at least need to do is really make sure that you track precisely what is the code and what is the software used, what is the input data used, what the recipes used, models based data of the neurons, what is supposed to be used. And then finally, maybe data personalization. The idea there is, or the challenge there is that we have so many data products, and it's going to be pretty bad in the human project. There's going to be a lot of data products, and not everybody will need all of them, and we need to kind of personalize the access to the data. Very much like Google does, right? Not all of you are getting the same query results. Google adapts the search results to your preferences to some degree. That's probably something that we also need to do for in a different context, of course, but for human brain projects, so that you have a personalized view on the database repositories of the HPP. And so with that, I would like to conclude. Enabling data exploration is key to scientific discovery. The prior spatial access methods, spatial data has been forgotten a little bit in the database community, data management community. And what we've done is, that's why it didn't scale with the data growth. I remember reading the first spatial data, papers about spatial data. The data sets were in the order of tens of megabytes, which is a challenge, right? I mean, these methods. I mean, I'm not saying it cannot scale to our data sets, but in our experience it did scale when we go to even just gigabytes, and we're going to see much more data. What we've done is we've developed several approaches. Most of them using one way or another this concept of spatial connectivity to accelerate analysis and queries. In some instances, we explicitly add these connectivity information. In others, the methods dealing with meshes, this connectivity was already available, so we used it, and with that, we were able to develop several approaches, several algorithms that efficiently analyze data in the project. But of course, there's many exciting big data management challenges that remain. And with that, I would like to conclude, and would like to ask if you have any questions at all.